Now, as mentioned, I'm a history student at Huron and Western. Now, for this year, for my course on the historian's craft, our major research project focused on Black Ontario history. We took part in a field trip to the Black Museum in October to find an object or an article and to place it as the focal point of our research for the year. While checking at the museum, this article on the wall instantly caught my eye. An article from the Toronto Telegram, Dresden Negro Warned Gets Gun for Safety. It sheds light on a story of severe racial discrimination in a small town of southwestern Ontario, the formidable civil rights movement birthed from the Chatham-Kent region, and the life of one man who was determined to change the status quo in Dresden, effectively changing the course of Canadian history forever. This article caught my attention, and I was fascinated to find the larger story behind it. Little did I know that with starting the research project, I would discover an account of incredible will and courage whose ripples are still felt today, close to 70 years after this article was printed on June 19, 1954. To provide context and appropriately set the stage, one must go back to a farm on the outskirts of Dresden. This is where the protagonist of the Telegram's article, Hugh Burnett, was born on July 14, 1918. The son of Robert Burnett and Myrtle Carter, both descendants of slaves that had escaped to southwestern Ontario in the 19th century on the Underground Railroad. Less than half an hour down the road from Chatham, Dresden too is integral to African Canadian history. Not only was the town a terminus for those escaping slavery on the Underground Railroad, and the migration of abolitionists seeking a haven rid of the systemic racism ingrained in the foundations of the United States, but it was also the home of Reverend Josiah Henson, a former slave and symbol of the abolitionist movement. Henson is also believed to be the inspiration for Harriet Beecher Stowe's famous book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, a historically fictitious account condemning slavery and detailing the extreme lengths went to for people to achieve freedom, that became a rallying cry for those hoping to achieve abolition. Despite the deep connections to the plight of abolishing slavery, Dresden stood as a town of many contradictions, just like its neighboring Chatham. Although it had no legally defined segregation in the housing of the local schools in the 1950s, Black people were customarily denied service at the 3 restaurants, the pool halls, barbershops, beauty parlor, and the Legion. Furthermore, even the churches were segregated, with Black churchgoers being told that they had their own church, the Baptist Church on Queen Street, to frequent instead. Just down the road, Black people were refused service at the coffee shop in the William Pitt Hotel in Chatham. And in Windsor, it was common knowledge that the Chrysler Automotive Factory had a policy against hiring, quote, coloreds. Hugh Burnett worked on his family's farm until being called up for military service at the outbreak of the Second World War, until he was discharged several months later due to a stomach condition. In 1943, whilst back home visiting his family, Burnett was denied service at Kay's Cafe in his military uniform. Enraged by this treatment as a Black serviceman, Burnett penned a complaint to the Federal Minister of Justice and future Prime Minister, Louis St. Laurent. He received a reply back from St. Laurent that racial discrimination was in fact not illegal. Burnett would remember this moment, and when he moved back to Dresden in 1948 to start a carpentry business, he was motivated to join 30 other Black Canadians from the Dresden, Chatham, and North Buxton area to establish the National Unity Association, the NUA. As referenced in the article from the Telegram, Burnett was made the secretary of the NUA, and with his burning passion and soft-spoken demeanor, effectively became their driving force and a key spokesperson. The NUA drafted a constitution as their primary objective to be as follows. 1. To promote the welfare of all people, regardless of color, creed, national origin, or religion. 2. To promote interest in better group relations. 3. To foster the spirit of equality. And 4. To instill a sense of pride and dignity in Black people. Emboldened by their established community organization, the NUA approached the Dresden Town Council, requesting the town to issue licenses to businesses only if they refused to take part in discriminatory practices. Unfortunately, only one councillor, Michael Fry, was in favor. To the dismay of the NUA, a referendum was later held in December 1949 and was struck down by a vote of 517 to 108, with the 17% in favor falling in line with the approximate population of the Black community in the town. This damning referendum noted as the only vote of its kind on banning discrimination in Canada, prompted the NUA to join a delegation to meet with the Premier of Ontario, Leslie Frost, as Dresden's notoriety in the press provided hard evidence for a requirement of legislation. Along with the Jewish Labour Committee of Canada, the NUA urged the Premier to fight against racism that the world had spent 6 years fighting against in World War II, only a few years prior. As a step to end discriminatory practices, Frost pushed for the Fair Employment Practices Act to ban discrimination in hiring practices in 1951, the first of its kind in Canada. Burnett was directly linked to this legislation being enacted, but did not go far enough to end the rampant discrimination plaguing Dresden and the rest of the country. Burnett would once again join a coalition of labor unions like the JLC once more in 1954. Burnett's message to Frost was clear. He was ashamed to have to plead for his fundamental democratic rights. And within a week from then, the Ontario legislature had passed the Fair Accommodation Practices Act on April 6, 1954. The key legislation read that no person shall deny to any person or class of persons the accommodation, services, or facilities available in any place to which the public is customarily admitted because of the race, creed, color, nationality, ancestry, or place of origin of such person or class of persons. 1954, Chapter 28, Section 2. This was a monumental victory for Burnett and the NUA, but did not mean that discrimination in Dresden had been defeated. Two of Dresden's restaurants, Emerson's Soda Bar Restaurant and Kay's Cafe, still refuse service to people of color, which is where the article from the Telegram comes into the story. Burnett and members of the NUA had been receiving threats since their proposition to the town council in 1949 over the business licenses, and had only gotten increasingly worse as their successes in civil rights began to grow. Now, as referenced in the article, as a precaution for his protection, Burnett had purchased a .38 revolver. Although, curiously, despite all of my research, how he acquired it is unknown. In defiance of the town's strongly held discrimination, the NUA had begun testing whether black patients would be served. On the night of June 18th, as the Telegram reports, Mr. and Mrs. Shadd, along with Mr. and Mrs. Robbins, all four of them black, were refused service at Kay's Cafe. Calling Mr. Burnett, he joined them to re-enter the restaurant, to which the proprietor, Morley McKay, confronted the group to again tell them he would refuse to serve them. What's curiously left out of the article is that no white patron said a word of protest, highlighting a theme in my research, that the townspeople believed in their ignorance that if they kept quiet, the issue would go away or simply disappear. The article also mentions this occurring to Chatham mailman Richard Henderson and his family, who were also denied service under the excuse of being too busy when they had been the only patrons in Kay's Cafe. Burnett would send word to the Ontario Labour Department, yet was unaware that the Minister of Labour, Charles Daly, was very much opposed to the act and tried to sabotage evidence of discrimination reports in Dresden for as long as he could. When on the spot, a series televising reports of Canadian life came to Dresden in the midst of this fight for civil rights. They too documented evidence of residents remaining opposed or woefully ignorant to the plight of their black neighbors. Reverend Gower of the North Dresden Baptist Church voiced his concerns that the NUA did not represent the majority of the black townspeople, whilst another local citizen went into a tirade of fear-mongering, claiming that changes would lead to civil war brought on by Jews and communists. Despite a staunch refusal to accept the new laws and remain the last stronghold of bigotry in Canada, as Mr. Henderson so eloquently put it, after months and months of testing and collecting evidence of McKay's and Mr. and Mrs. Emerson's blatant discriminatory practices, Burnett and the NUA would finally receive justice as both parties were charged in accordance to the Fair Accommodations Practices Act that Burnett had worked so hard to have created. This story does not have a happy ending for everyone. In his lifetime, the heroic work of Hugh Burnett would sadly go unrewarded. Due to the hard lobbying to fight for a better Dresden and better country for marginalized communities, he was ostracized in his carpentry business with dwindling clientele and accruing debt. Moving to London, Ontario in 1957 in an effort to find work, Burnett would never live in Dresden again, although he remained an avid supporter of the NUA and civil rights all through his life, despite keeping a low profile and never receiving the just recognition that he deserved. History professor Dr. Graham Broad writes that in his historical research, there is a shaft of light we shine on remnants of the past, which we call sources. But we can only shed light on fragments of the past, not on its entirety. Which is true. We can never go directly back to the past or come to understand it solely from one object or article. However, the illumination itself that it provides can do more than enough at opening up untold or forgotten stories, breathing life into them, and hopefully recognizing the triumphs that have fallen into the darkness. This article from the Toronto Telegram does precisely that, shining light on the actions of Hugh Burnett, and it is my hope that taking on this as my research project provides the long overdue recognition for the feats he conquered and the sacrifices he made of prosperity in his own life for the betterment of all people of color in Canada, with his vigilance in pushing for fair employment and the end of discriminatory practices in service. Hugh Burnett was not only a carpenter, but an unsung Canadian hero. As best described by his daughter, Patricia, "I don't know if I believe in destiny, but I think that he was on this earth to do what he did. He had to do it. And for what he did, Canada is a better place because of Hugh Burnett." Thank you.